Hi, Dr. Windish from Sparks Pediatric and Adolescent Medicine. Welcome to our video series for parents. This will probably be my last video from Sparks Pediatrics because I'm closing the practice. But stay tuned, I may have some new content coming in the future. Today I wanted to talk a little bit, and this is really for students and residents and stuff, about something nobody talks about in med school and grad school, but something that's very important to all of my students, and that is the most common piece of medical hardware, stethoscopes. And we want to talk a little bit about the differences in stethoscopes and what the heck it is you want to buy, because they're expensive. First little known secret for a lot of students is that almost everything on the stethoscope is replaceable and much cheaper than buying a new stethoscope. So let's start with keeping that in mind. That being said, let's start at the top and work our way down. Earpieces, these things have to stay in your ears. Whatever they are, need to be comfortable. Personally, I like them squishy, and I don't know if you can see if this squishes or not, but mine are squishy. A lot of times they come with hard little tips on. If you like them, hey, great, more power to you. But if they're uncomfortable, for crying out loud, replace them. If your kit came with squishy tips, put the squishy tips on. Otherwise, contact your dealer. Something like Amazon.com often will have other ear tips that you can buy. I have spare ones sitting in a drawer. The squishy tips, unlike the hard tips, do rot out, especially living here in the desert, and I need to replace them, which is why I have spare ones sitting in my desk drawer down here. They make some that are a little bit firmer depending on the company that you're using. The next part is the metal piece here. This metal piece in better stethoscopes can move and rotate a little bit, and you can rotate it so that it lines up with your ear canals. Whatever you buy, you want to make sure they do rotate a little bit so that you can get the angle that you want. Probably the most important part to consider when you're buying a stethoscope is the tube. Okay? They come really in three styles. The first is a single tube. The tube tends to be thin and more like a little bit larger than a piece of spaghetti, maybe like a round piece of linguine almost. And with that, you hear things in monaural, so monophonic. And it just depends on how well trained your ears are. I know some really good cardiologists, that's all they use. Pediatric cardiologists at that, where they're listening for really subtle heart murmurs, and that's what they use. They've used for their entire career. Their ears are well trained, and it's not an issue. All right, for mere mortals like me, I think I need a little bit more, but that's just me. The next thing to come around on the market was actually a two-tube device, and you can see the two tubes. It's for binaural or almost stereo sound, but there'll be two separate tubes here. Sprague Rapport makes a two-tube device that works very well. The problem for me in pediatrics is those tubes rub together and they can create some adventitial sounds. And especially when I'm dealing with children, especially babies who will reach out and grab the tubes, they'll rub them together. And then you can't tell, is that the baby playing with your stethoscope or is that some kind of adventitial chest sound? So I don't like two tubes flopping in the breeze, but that's because of my patients. They are much cheaper though. And then somewhere in the late 80s, I'm drawing a blank now as to which company makes your stethoscope?
Littman.
I've got a student in the background here holding the camera. Littman came up with the tube within a tube design, and other companies have adopted it as well. So what you can't see on this is there's actually two tubes, but if I chopped this in half and cut it and you look down on it, it's actually a solid piece of rubber with two holes bored in it parallel to each other that gets you the binaural sound. But because they're within solid rubber, they don't rub together. Okay? And that gets me binaural sound without rubbing together, and that's what Littman does in some of their higher-end stethoscopes. I, however, don't use a Littman. I use a different stethoscope. We'll come back to that. Next has to do with diaphragm bell size. Do you want a pediatric scope, a neonatal scope? Do you want an adult scope, etc.? I'm a pediatrician, so it's a balancing act between the size of your diaphragm and your bell and the ability to localize chest sounds. So the smaller the diaphragm and the bell, the less area it'll sample, the easier it is to localize chest sound. However, the harder it is to actually hear anything, the volume goes down. And so a lot of the neonatal scopes that they make, which aren't really much bigger than, well, much bigger than my finger, it's really hard to hear anything with them. And again, I know a lot of pediatric cardiologists that don't like using those even to auscultate neonates, even the tiny little preemies, because they just can't hear anything through those tiny bells and diaphragms. And they would much rather have less of an ability to localize a sound than to miss a sound. The other problem is, if you're somebody like me where your patients come between this big and 25 years of age, when you're dealing with a 16, 17-year-old kid, if you've got a really small bell and diaphragm like that, in order to make sure you're not missing an area of consolidation and crackling, you got to sample with your ear 27 different times and have him breathe. Okay, another deep breath, another deep breath, another deep breath, deep breath, deep breath, deep breath, because you got to make sure you don't miss any areas on the chest. Now, if you have a bell and diaphragm that's as big as my face, you won't miss that, but then you don't know which lobes are involved. And if you're listening for heart murmurs, you won't be able to tell, if there's a murmur somewhere in his chest, but I can't tell you where it is because my diaphragm's as big as his heart, or as big as his whole head. So it's a balancing act, and you kind of have to keep that in mind with regards to the size of your patients. If you're dealing strictly with football players on a NFL or university football team, wow, I think that one's pretty straightforward, what size you want. But if you're like me and your patients come in all sizes, there are some choices that have to be made. Definitely make sure you have a bell of some sort. Diaphragm's actually not as important as somebody somewhere in your physical exam class probably taught you. You can use your bell as a diaphragm, but you can never use a diaphragm as a bell. These are replaceable. They just screw off. And somewhere I actually have the adult diaphragm for this. I just never ever use it, so I don't even know where it is. I like having the rubber here and here so I don't have to put cold metal on my patient's chest. I think the patients appreciate it. These rubber gaskets are replaceable. I have spare ones for both the diaphragm and the bell sitting in my desk. And you can buy new diaphragms. They're actually pretty inexpensive for this particular brand of stethoscope. And even the more expensive Littmans, you can buy all the replacement parts. Going back to the tubing for a minute, tubing length is important and nobody talks about this. All right, first, there's no reason to have tubing longer than your arm. If it's any longer than this, I can't stretch my arm out that long. So unless I plan on having the patient auscultate himself across the room, who needs one that's 6 feet long, right? So, okay, too long is bad. Why do you want long at all? Well, the further you are away from the patient, the less likely they are to cough on you, plain and simple. However, no point having it longer than your arm. So if you got short arms, short tubes. Say, okay, well, if long is good, why bother with short tubes? Because shorter gives you better amplification of sound. The longer the tube, the more you damp out the sound in the tube, the less you hear. So a 27-foot long tube, you're not going to hear anything through. A 2-inch tube, you'll definitely hear stuff through, but then you're on top of the patient getting coughed on. So how long is too long? Depends on how prone your patients are to coughing on you. And really that's going to depend on your patient population. If you're dealing with a lot of neurologically devastated patients where they can't follow instructions, or patients with mental health issues where they won't follow instructions, Maybe you want a slightly longer tube, but again, no point having it longer than your arm. If you're dealing with a lot of cooperative athletes, shorter is better. But remember, the whole point of a stethoscope was so that you don't have to put your head on top of somebody's chest. That's what they were invented for. So longer has its advantages, but shorter has its advantages too. And in fact, this stethoscope, which is made by Tychos, and Littmann stethoscope, both have varying size tubes that you can buy when you're buying the stethoscope or when you're trading out stethoscope tubing. The tubing here in the desert does rot. This piece right here, including the plastic U, is replaceable, or you can leave this piece alone and just replace the tubing. It just pulls off here, it just yanks out. There's little barbs that hold it in place, and same thing on this end, just one good yank and it'll come right out, and you just shove the next one on. It's just 2 seconds to do. Personally, I like the Tychos. All right, and this is, again, my series of compromises. What I don't like about Littmann is Littmann's better stethoscopes. Littmann's cheaper stethoscopes are light, but their better stethoscopes are very heavy. And I didn't like that heaviness. The Tychos is lighter. I got to keep this thing on my person most of the day, so being a little bit lighter is better. And they have a better pediatric diaphragm and a better pediatric bell than does Littmann, where the bell is always huge. And often they don't have a pediatric diaphragm, but rather an adapter that goes over the pediatric bell. And I didn't like dealing with that. These guys have a better one. Tychos is also a lot cheaper. Does that mean don't use a Littmann? I've got like 3 Littmanns that I used through residency in the first part of my career. Someone gave me a Tychos as a graduation gift after residency, and that was when I made the change. I wouldn't have bought one for myself because I had the others and they're perfectly good and excellent high quality materials. And as as I've changed things and customized my equipment to my practice, that's just what I've chosen. But other people use plenty of other things. Do you need to stick with Littmann and Tychos? Well, I've already talked about Sprague Rapport, and then there's dozens of generics on the market as well. Some of the rubbers break down faster, but then again, you can always replace them. Some of the tubing or some of the metal is not as high quality, but then again, those are often replaceable. It's really all about the bell and diaphragm. These are all designed to just, kind of transmit sound for you without sound loss. There's no moving parts in there other than the ability to rotate the head. So that being said, how high quality does it really need to be? It needs to be good enough to last you for whatever you're using it for. And if you use stethoscopes a lot and they're beaten up by your patients, that's one thing. And if you rarely need a stethoscope because of the nature of your practice, that's something else. Point of my discussion is not to sell you on any particular brand, but really help you to understand the ins and outs and the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of materials that are out there. Make sure you pick something ultimately that's comfortable, not going to wear your shoulders out, not going to hurt your ears, and that is functional, so that somebody doesn't upsell you or downsell you garbage. And what's garbage? Garbage is whatever doesn't work for you. Maybe an $800 stethoscope, which as of my speaking right now in 2017, an $800 stethoscope would be obscenely expensive. But so that you don't get upsold or downsold, because it may be worth $800 to buy it, but if it's not what you need, it's garbage. Now you know. So good luck.